The worst part is not that my parents turned my childhood bedroom into a guest room. The worst part is that I helped them pick out the new curtains, and I smiled when my mother showed me the throw pillows, and I said it looks beautiful. Mom and she had absolutely no idea that 3 weeks earlier, I had sat in my attorney's office and removed both of my parents from a will that would have changed their entire retirement. And I let them believe we were fine. I let them believe the room thing was water under the bridge. I let them believe I had forgiven them completely, and I had not forgiven them at all. And everything that happened after that conversation about curtains was me letting them walk deeper into a trust they no longer deserved. My name is Caroline Whitfield, and I am 41 years old, and I own a small but very profitable interior design firm in Connecticut. And I bought my first property at 29, and my second at 33. And by 38, I had built something real and quiet and entirely mine, and my parents knew I was doing well, but they did not know the specifics, because I had learned early that specifics give people leverage, and my parents had always used leverage. And the room situation was not the beginning, it was just the moment I finally stopped pretending it wasn't a pattern. Here is what happened. I called my parents in October to tell them I was coming home for Thanksgiving, and my mother said, "Oh, Caroline, we need to tell you something." And I said, "Okay," and she said, "We've redone your room," and I said, "What do you mean?" "Redone," and she said, "We converted it into a proper guest room." And I said, "That's my room, Mom," and she said, "You haven't lived here in 15 years." And I said, "It's still my room, it's where I stay when I visit," and my father got on the line and said, "Caroline, you're a grown woman. You can sleep in the guest room." And I said, "I am sleeping in the guest room, apparently." And he said, "Don't be dramatic." And my mother said, "We thought you'd be happy for us. We needed the space." And I said, "For what?" And there was a pause, and my mother said, "We've been having people over more." And I said, "People." And she said, "Friends from church and some of your father's colleagues." And I sat with that for a moment. I sat with the fact that my room had been dismantled and redecorated so that my parents could host acquaintances more comfortably. And I said, "I see." And my mother said, "You're not upset, are you?" And I said, "No, Mom. I think it looks great from the photos." And I meant none of it. What they did not know, and what I had never told them, was that 2 years prior I had updated my will and included both of them as secondary beneficiaries after my husband David, and the estate at that point was worth enough that their inclusion was not a symbolic gesture. It was a meaningful one, and I had done it because I believed at the time that family was family, regardless of history, and I had spent a lot of years trying to believe that, and the room was the thing that cracked it. Open, not because of the room itself, but because of what my mother said when I pushed back gently and said, "I just wish you'd asked me." And she said, "Caroline, we don't need your permission to manage our own home." And my father said, "Exactly," and those 2 words exactly landed somewhere in my chest and woke something up. Because I had heard exactly like that. My entire childhood, I had heard exactly when I asked why my brother's college fund was larger than mine, and exactly when I asked why my, achievements were mentioned less at family dinners, and exactly when I asked why my visits always involved me adjusting and accommodating, and never them. And the room was just the most recent, exactly. And I decided I was done collecting them. I called my attorney the following Monday, and I removed them quietly and without drama. And then I did something that I am not entirely proud of, but that I understand completely, which is that I called my mother back that same evening, and I said, "Mom, I've been thinking and I was being too sensitive." And she said, "Oh, I'm so glad you said that." And I said, "The room looks really lovely." And she said, "I knew you'd come around." And I said, "I want to come see it in person before Thanksgiving. Can I come next weekend?" And she said, "Of course." And that was when I stepped back into their lives as the healed daughter, and not a single part of me was healed. The weekend visit was warm, and my mother made my favorite dinner, and my father showed me his garden, and I admired the guest room genuinely, because my mother has good taste. And I sat at their kitchen table, and I drank tea, and I listened to them talk about retirement and what they were hoping for in the next 10 years. And my mother mentioned that she and my father had been thinking about downsizing, and that things were a little tighter than expected, and my father said the pension wasn't quite what they'd projected, and my mother looked at me in that specific way. She had always looked at me when the conversation was turning towards something she needed, and I recognized the look immediately, and I held my tea with both hands, and I said, "That sounds stressful." And she said, "It is a little." And my father said, "We're fine. We're managing." And my mother said, "We just want to make sure we've planned well." And I said, "That's smart." And I said nothing else. And the look passed, and we talked about something different, and I stayed 2 nights, and I hugged them both at the door when I left. And my mother said, "It's so good when we're like this, Caroline." And I said, "I know, Mom," and I got in my car and I drove home. Over the next 4 months, I was the best version of a dutiful daughter, I called. Every Sunday, I sent my mother a book she mentioned wanting. I helped my father research a plumbing issue over the phone. I showed up for their anniversary dinner and I toasted them genuinely because 43 years together is real regardless of everything else. And my mother started sending me longer texts, and my father started asking about my work with actual curiosity, and I could feel them relaxing into the version of me they preferred, which was the version that didn't push back, and I let them relax. And I kept my attorney's paperwork in a drawer, and I did not feel guilty. And I want to be honest about that. I did not feel guilty because guilt requires believing you've done something wrong, and removing people from a document they never knew they were in is not a wound. It is a correction. The moment of exposure did not come dramatically, it came practically. And that is somehow worse because there was no confrontation, no speech, no scene. Just a Tuesday afternoon in March when my mother called and said, "Caroline, your Aunt Patricia mentioned you have a will," and I said, "I do." And she said you'd included us. And I paused just 1 second. And I said, "I should be transparent with you. Mom, I updated the will a few months ago." And she said, "Updated how?" And I said, "I restructured the beneficiaries," and she was quiet. And then she said, "Are we still in it?" And I said, "No." And she said, "Caroline," and I said, "Mom, I've been thinking about this for a long time. And it wasn't the room specifically, it was what the room represented." And she said, "What does that mean?" And I said, "It means that my entire life when I asked for consideration, I was told I was being dramatic, and the room was the last time I'm going to accept that." And she said, "This is about throw pillows." And I said, "It's about 41 years of exactly." And she didn't have a response to that. And my father wasn't home, and she said, "I need to talk to your father." And I said, "Okay." And she said, "I can't believe you did this while sitting at my kitchen table drinking my tea." And I said, "I know." And I let that sit because she wasn't wrong, and I wasn't apologizing. My father called the next day, and he was angry in the careful way he got angry when he knew he didn't have solid footing. And he said, "Caroline, this is manipulative." And I said, "I disagree." And he said, "You came here and acted like everything was fine." And I said, "Everything was fine. I enjoyed the visit genuinely." And he said, "But you had already done it." And I said, "Yes." And he said, "That's deceptive." And I said, "Dad, I spent 3 decades telling you both when something hurt and being told I was overreacting. And this time I just skipped that part." And he said, "It's not the same." And I said, "I know, and I genuinely meant that because it isn't the same. I did not give them the chance to dismiss me again. I just made a decision about my own estate and let the outcomes speak, and there is a cleanness to that I had never felt before in any conversation with my parents. What my parents wanted was for me to fight and apologize and reverse it. And what I did instead was stay calm and stay warm and stay completely unmoved, and I think that was harder for them than any argument would have been because they had always known how to handle my emotions, and they did not know how to handle my stillness. And my mother called twice more in April, and both times I was kind, and both times I did not change my position. And by May, she had stopped bringing it up, and we were back to Sunday calls, and I was back to being a good daughter because I am a good daughter. I just stopped being a charitable one, and the will stays as it is, and the guest room stays as it is, and I stay exactly as I am. And the false peace my mother felt when I said the curtains looked beautiful was the most expensive mistake she ever made, because she thought my forgiveness was free, and it was not. It just didn't cost what she expected.